wind howled through the dense forests surrounding the small settlement of Groton, Massachusetts, in the bleak winter of 1671. It was a sound that carried more than just the biting cold of the New England season. To the deeply religious Puritan settlers establishing their lives on this frontier, the wind whispered of the invisible world that lay just beyond their sight. They believed in a realm where angels and demons waged a constant war for the human soul. In this isolated village surrounded by the encroaching wilderness, the line between the physical world and the spiritual nightmare was about to dissolve. Darkness was not merely the absence of light, but a living, breathing entity waiting to enter their homes. Reverend Samuel Willard was a man of immense intellect and rigid faith, who served as the spiritual shepherd for the people of Groton. His home was meant to be a fortress of piety and a sanctuary against the evils of the world. However, even the most sanctified walls can crumble when the enemy strikes from within. The Willard household was busy and crowded, filled with the noise of daily chores and prayer. Yet a silence began to creep into the corners of the rooms, a heavy atmosphere that made the candles flicker and the air turn stagnant. Something had taken an interest in the inhabitants of this house, specifically targeting a young woman whose mind was ripe for intrusion. Elizabeth Knapp was the 16-year-old servant of Reverend Samuel Willard and the daughter of a local farmer. She was by all accounts a typical girl of her station, tasked with the arduous labor of maintaining a colonial household. But beneath her ordinary exterior, a tempest was brewing that would soon engulf the entire community. It began innocuously enough, with sudden pains that she could not explain. She would clutch her sides or her head, claiming that something was gripping her from the inside. At first, the household dismissed it as simple illness or fatigue from the long hours of work. They did not know that these physical ailments were merely the knocking at the gate. The situation escalated rapidly in the cold days of November, when Elizabeth began to exhibit behaviors that defied all medical explanation. She would fall into sudden fits of laughter that sounded jarring and devoid of any true mirth, only to be followed immediately by uncontrollable weeping. Her body would contort in ways that seemed impossible for a human frame, twisting and bending against the natural range of her joints. Samuel Willard watched with growing dread as his servant was tossed about by an invisible force like a rag doll. He documented these events, meticulously sensing that he was witnessing a battle that went far beyond mere hysteria or physical sickness. Physicians were summoned to the Willard residence to examine the girl, but their knowledge of humors and bloodletting proved useless against this affliction. The doctor observed Elizabeth during one of her violent episodes and declared that the distemper was not natural. This diagnosis sent a ripple of terror through the small community of Groton. If the cause was not natural, then it must be preternatural. The fear of witchcraft and demonic influence was always present in the Puritan mind. But now it had a focal point. The neighbors began to whisper and cast suspicious glances at one another, wondering who might have opened the door to the devil. Elizabeth complained of a sensation of strangulation, as if invisible hands were wrapping around her throat to cut off her breath. Her eyes would bulge, and her face would turn a terrifying shade of purple as she clawed at the empty air. During these moments, she was unable to speak, only capable of producing guttural choking sounds that chilled the blood of anyone present. Reverend Samuel Willard would fall to his knees beside her, reciting psalms and prayers in a desperate attempt to drive back the unseen assailant. But the entity gripping Elizabeth seemed to mock his efforts, tightening its hold. Whenever the name of God was spoken, the torment was not limited to physical pain. As Elizabeth began to see apparitions that were invisible to everyone else in the room, she claimed to see two distinct figures lurking in the shadows of the house. One was an old man with a stern gray countenance, and the other was a dark woman who whispered secrets into her ear. These specters would approach her when she was alone or vulnerable, offering her respite from the pain in exchange for her allegiance. The psychological pressure was immense, as the entities played on her fears and desires, urging her to abandon the strict path of righteousness she had been taught. As the possession deepened, the behavior of Elizabeth Knapp became increasingly erratic and disturbing to behold. She would sometimes leap over furniture with superhuman agility, or exhibit strength that required 3 grown men to restrain her. Her voice would change, losing the timbre of a teenage girl and taking on a deep guttural quality that sounded ancient and malevolent. This new voice would spew profanities and insults at the Reverend, calling him a rogue and a liar. It was a shocking display of rebellion in a society where obedience to authority and the church was the cornerstone of existence. The entity speaking through Elizabeth began to reveal the terms of the temptation that had been placed before her. It spoke of money and fine clothes, things that a poor servant girl could only dream of possessing. The devil promised her a life of ease and luxury if she would only sign his book and pledge her soul to him. This was the classic Puritan nightmare brought to life, the transaction of the soul for worldly gain. Elizabeth would weep and scream that she did not want to sign, but her hand would move involuntarily, as if guiding a quill across an invisible page. Reverend Samuel Willard was a man of science as well as faith, and he observed these phenomena with a critical eye. He noted that during her fits, Elizabeth was often blind and deaf to the people around her, reacting only to the internal stimuli of her tormentors. Yet there were moments of lucid clarity where she would beg for help and forgiveness, confessing her own sins that she believed had invited the evil in. She spoke of discontent with her station and disobedience to her parents, admitting that she had harbored dark thoughts long before the fits began. The horror reached a new peak when Elizabeth began to accuse a neighbor of being the witch responsible for her suffering. She claimed that a specific woman in the village was appearing to her in spectral form and commanding the demons to attack. This was a dangerous development that threatened to tear the social fabric of Groton apart. In the Puritan legal system, spectral evidence was a contentious issue, and an accusation could lead to trial and execution. Willard, however, exercised great caution and refused to name the woman, publicly fearing that hysteria would lead to the shedding of innocent blood. The physical manifestations of the possession became more grotesque as the weeks dragged on into the depth of winter. Elizabeth would vomit up strange objects or claim that she could feel a rat moving inside her body. Witnesses watched in horror as swelling moved beneath her skin, traveling from her stomach to her throat. She would cry out that the devil was burning her, or that he was beating her with iron rods. The violence of these attacks left her exhausted and bruised a visible map of the spiritual warfare being waged upon her flesh. During one particularly terrifying night, the voice issuing from Elizabeth claimed that it was not just one demon, but a legion. The voice bragged about its power and its intention to destroy the Willard family and the entire town of Groton. It mocked the prayers of the congregation, who had gathered to fast and pray for the girl's deliverance. The entity seemed to feed on the attention, and the fear growing stronger with every terrified gasp from the onlookers. Samuel Willard stood firm in the center of this storm, holding his Bible like a shield. The psychological complexity of the case became apparent when Elizabeth admitted to a pact she had almost made. She described meeting a black dog in the woods, which transformed into the shape of a man. This figure had offered her relief from her daily drudgery, and she confessed that she had listened to him. This admission of partial guilt complicated the narrative. Was she a victim of assault or a willing participant in her own damnation? The lines blurred, leaving the observers in a state of moral confusion and heightened anxiety. There were moments when Elizabeth would be thrown into the fire on the hearth, only to be pulled back just before the flames could consume her clothes. She would attempt to throw herself down the stairs or strike her head against the wooden posts of the bed. It required constant vigilance from the household to keep her from destroying herself. The entity seemed bent on her physical destruction, using her own body as a weapon against her. The stress on the Willard family was unimaginable, living in a house that had become a theater of war. Reverend Samuel Willard documented the dual nature of her speech, where one voice would pray for salvation, while another would immediately interject with blasphemy. It was a literal dialogue between good and evil occurring within one throat. The demonic voice would taunt Elizabeth, telling her that she was already damned and that God had forsaken her. It was a psychological torture designed to break her will and drive her into the depths of despair. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as the theological battle played out in real time. The winter snows piled high around the house, trapping the inhabitants with the horror inside. The isolation of the village meant that help was far away, and they were forced to rely on their own spiritual resources. The nights were the worst when the shadows lengthened and the wind rattled the window panes. Elizabeth would often see the devil standing in the corner of the room, grinning at her. She described his appearance in vivid detail, sometimes as a gentleman, and other times as a beast with cloven feet and horns. As the case gained notoriety, people from neighboring towns traveled to Groton to witness the possession of Elizabeth Knapp. The spectacle served as a grim reminder of the power of the devil and the necessity of constant vigilance. Willard used the opportunity to preach on the dangers of sin and the reality of the spiritual world. However, he remained skeptical of some of the more theatrical elements, always questioning how much was genuine possession and how much might be psychological delusion or illness. One evening, Elizabeth sat bolt upright in bed, her eyes rolled back into her head so that only the whites were visible. She began to speak in a voice that was low and rasping, claiming that the devil had entered her fully. She said that her soul was locked away and that her body now belonged to the enemy. The room grew impossibly cold, and the observers felt a heavy presence pressing down on their chests. It was the moment of total confrontation, where the human host seemed to have been completely displaced by the invading spirit. The entity challenged Willard, directly questioning his authority and his faith. It knew secrets about the people in the room, things that Elizabeth could not possibly have known. This display of hidden knowledge convinced many of the skeptics that a supernatural intelligence was indeed at work. The devil accused the townspeople of hypocrisy and secret sins, turning their own guilt against them. The room was filled with the sound of weeping and terrified prayers as the entity laid bare the darkness in their own hearts. Despite the intensity of the possession, there were periods of remission where Elizabeth would return to her normal self. In these moments, she was exhausted and confused, with little memory of the violence she had displayed. She would weep softly and beg the Reverend to save her. These lucid intervals were almost more heartbreaking than the fits, as they showed the human cost of the affliction. A young girl was being eroded away by a force she could not comprehend or control, leaving only a shell behind. The accusations against the neighbor continued to be a source of tension, but Willard remained firm in his refusal to prosecute based on the words of a demon. argued that the devil was the father of lies, and therefore his testimony could not be trusted, even if it appeared to help the court. This theological stance likely saved the life of the accused woman, preventing a witch hunt from erupting in Groton 20 years before the tragedy at Salem. It was a rare moment of rationality in an age of superstition. As spring approached, the violence of the fits began to subside slowly. The grip of the entity seemed to loosen, though it did not let go entirely. Elizabeth was left weak and spiritually scarred, but alive. The dramatic confrontations became less frequent, replaced by a lingering depression and melancholy. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief, hoping that the season of darkness had passed. But the memory of the voice and the contorted body remained etched in their minds forever. Elizabeth Knapp eventually confessed that the entire episode had begun with her own discontent and willingness to entertain the devil. She took responsibility for opening the door, claiming that her own sinful nature was the root cause. This confession fit perfectly into the Puritan worldview, which viewed suffering as a punishment for sin or a test of faith. It allowed the community to make sense of the chaos and restore a sense of order. The devil had been invited in, but he had also been cast out. The aftermath of the possession left the Willard household changed forever. The innocence of the frontier life had been shattered, revealing the terrors that lay just beneath the surface. Reverend Samuel Willard compiled his notes into a detailed account, which circulated among the intellectual elite of New England. His objective writing style provided a window into the Puritan mind and the reality of their fears. It remains one of the most significant documents of colonial history, capturing the dread of the unknown. Elizabeth Knapp survived her ordeal and eventually married, continuing to live in the region. She faded back into obscurity, leaving the stage of history as quickly as she had entered it. But one has to wonder what scars she carried for the rest of her life. Did she still hear the whispers in the wind, or see the dark man in the shadows? The trauma of those winter months must have haunted her quiet moments, a reminder of the time she became a vessel for the abyss. The case of Elizabeth Knapp serves as a chilling prologue to the hysteria that would consume Salem 2 decades later. It contained all the same elements, including adolescent girls, strange fits, and accusations of witchcraft. However, the outcome in Groton was different thanks largely to the restraint of Samuel Willard. It stands as a testament to how leadership can determine the difference between a tragedy and a massacre. Yet the fear it generated planted seeds that would eventually bear poisonous fruit. 5 years after the possession, Groton was attacked and burned to the ground during King Philip's War. The native warriors descended upon the town, and the settlers were forced to flee. Some saw this as the final judgment, the physical destruction following the spiritual invasion. the land itself seemed cursed, rejected by God, and claimed by violence. The Willard house, where the possession occurred, was reduced to ash, erasing the physical evidence of the struggle. Today, the town of Groton is a quiet, modern community, but the history remains buried in the archives and the soil. The story of Elizabeth Knapp is a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the power of belief. When we look back at the records, we are not just reading about superstition, but about the primal fear of the dark. The entities that plagued Elizabeth may have been demons, or they may have been the manifestations of a repressed society screaming to be heard. The woods surrounding Groton are still deep and dark, holding the secrets of the past. If you stand there on a cold November night and listen to the wind, you might hear the faint echo of a girl's laughter turning into a scream. The invisible world that the Puritans feared is not gone. It has simply been forgotten by a world that relies on electric light to banish the shadows. But darkness does not need to be acknowledged to exist. It waits patiently in the corners, watching and listening. The legacy of the possession is a lingering dread that suggests the door between worlds is never truly locked. It only takes a moment of weakness, a single invitation for the latch to be lifted. Elizabeth Knapp was the vessel, but the water that filled her flows through the bedrock of history. We tell ourselves that we are safe in our modern rationality, but fear is a universal language. The possession of Elizabeth Knapp was not just a historical event. It was a warning that the things which hide in the dark are always looking for a way in.